All right, so let's get this going. Good morning, everyone. My name is Scott Meehan. I'm the Vice President of Commercial Medicare and Retail Sales. And on behalf of Blue Cross and Blue Shield, we'd like to welcome everyone this morning to today's webinar on supporting family caregivers. Next slide, please. I'd like to start for thanking each of you for joining us for this very important installment of the account webinar series. We've been very excited to bring this account webinar series to everyone in these meaningful topics to help you maximize your plan benefits. Hopefully you've been taking advantage of the account webinar series to hear from a wide range of topics directly from our subject matter experts. Next slide. Now, before jumping into today's webinar, we do have a few logistics we'd like to review. As you can see on the slide here, that both the chat and the Q&A button are available and have been turned on. Hopefully you'll lean in and ask any questions you may have. Use the chat button to participate in today's conversation and provide any comments you may have. Next slide. Now, it's important to point out that today's webinar is being recorded, and that we will be providing everyone in a week or so both a copy of today's recording as well as today's deck. Also, we will be asking everyone to complete a survey, and we encourage that you take advantage of the surveys to provide your feedback as well as your input, because that is important to us. Next slide. So with that said, I am very excited to introduce everyone on today's webinar on supporting family caregivers, to learn about who are they, what do they struggle with, and how we can support them. I can say that this is a new topic for me as I'm starting to learn how caregivers impact the people that surround me. So we're joined today with three amazing experts. We have Desiree Entente, who's the Senior Director of Medical Policy here at Blue Cross and Blue Shield. We have Dr. Ken Duckworth, our resident expert on mental health, as well as Alexandra Drane, our co-founder of ARCHANGELS. Now, for those of you who don't know, ARCHANGELS is a national movement platform that is reframing how caregivers are seen, honored, and supported using a combination of stories. So we're so happy to have Alex with us this morning. So with that said, I'll turn it over to Desiree to lead the conversation.
Hi, good morning. So I'll be moderating our conversation today. This is a really important topic that we want to cover today, and now more than ever has it come to the forefront as caregivers are dealing with not only the people that they're caring for, but also the pandemic and that push and pull of trying to balance everything that's landed on their plate all of a sudden. I'm going to start with sharing my story as a caregiver. I am a mother of 3 children, and one of my children has cerebral palsy. She had a stroke somewhere. We're not sure when or how or why. Maybe it was when I was pregnant with her. Maybe it was in the first few weeks of life. We found out when she was about 9 months old, and she has something called right-sided hemiplegia. Now, fast forward 6 years, I'm going to give you a snapshot in our life now about what it feels and looks like to be a caregiver for me today. Because my daughter has cerebral palsy, we are in appointments all the time. Physical therapy, occupational therapy, neurologist, this person, that person. And in order to juggle everything, get it all done, I often bring my computer with me and I'm working in the waiting room. And I'm always the person in the corner. I feel so antisocial, but I'm trying, taking calls, trying to do my computer work. The other moms and sitting over there, they're chatting with each other. And I don't have time for that. I got to get my work done. And sometimes there was just one day where it became too much for me, that whole moment of being in that waiting room, waiting for my daughter to come back from her session, seeing these other people who seemed to be dealing with it better than I did. And I needed to take a step back. I happened to have brought a book with me, and I said, okay, I'm just going to let my brain relax. I'm going to read this book a little bit. And there was a quote in the book that really struck me. And my daughter came back from her session as I was reading this quote, and I'm going to read it to you. And it says, feeling the rich and embroidered texture of life, the torn cloth of our world that is endlessly being ripped and rewoven. I was reading these words as my daughter came back, and she was all smiles. She was so proud of herself for what she had accomplished in her session. She was more than excited to tell me about it. And that's what it felt like in that moment, where I had to take a step back because it felt like my tapestry of my life was being ripped apart a little bit. The stress of having to deal with the work and being in that place and not being able to be where I wanted to, but then immediately was rewoven when she came back. And I felt that joy and that pride that she had felt in herself. And that's what it feels like to be a caregiver in my experience, where every time something happens, you get a phone call from the doctor's office, or you have to go pick up a medication, or you have to juggle this other thing that continuously is being balanced on your plate, and that tapestry of our lives is constantly being torn apart. But then that the joy of being a caregiver as well is constantly sewing it back together and making it stronger in some ways. And that's my own personal story and journey in this space. But what does it actually mean to be a caregiver? So not all caregivers have children with disabilities. The caregiver is basically anyone who's taking care of a friend, a family member, a neighbor, and who's not getting paid to do this work. And the care that they're giving doesn't have to be medical care. It doesn't have to be tube feeds and taking care of their daily activities of daily living. Sometimes it can be a phone call. Sometimes it could be helping with an appointment. Sometimes it's, arranging for a meal. And it's a very holistic view of what caregiving is today. And that's what we're going to be talking about. Now, first, I'd like to welcome Ken Duckworth, as we had introduced him before as our resident behavioral health specialist. Ken, why do you care about caregiving in general? How does that relate to mental health? And why is it important to look at those two things in conjunction?
First of all, Desiree, thank you for sharing that. That was actually a beautiful story you told. And for those of you who don't know Desiree, she's one of our most amazing teammates. And so I really had no awareness at all of, the pressures upon her. So I just want to start by saying thank you. May is Mental Health Awareness Month. It's a good time to have these conversations. I'm also the part-time Chief Medical Officer for the National Alliance on Mental Illness. And our slogan is, "You are not alone." And one of the things that's quite clear once you tap into this area, which there hasn't been enough attention to, is that many people are caregivers. Also say that it's very clear that the isolation and stress and anxiety of the pandemic has impacted a lot of the caregivers in terms of their mental health. It's often difficult for caregivers to look after themselves. And so I think we're very fortunate to have Desiree and Alex as part of this conversation. So I'll turn it back to you, Desiree.
Great, thank you. And now, Alex, you've been working in this space for a very long time, for years and years, and you are a big believer in data and stories and science. Could you please share some of the data and the stories that you think will resonate with this audience?
Yeah, I will. I'm actually going to share some slides in a second. I just want to echo what Ken just said. I think what's going to change culture is we have to change the conversation by being open about what's going on, because it is going on for so many people. And when you share stories so beautifully, that is how we rewrite that narrative and weave together that tapestry. So that's a beautiful quote. I hope you're going to share that for each of us, because I have a quote book and I want to add it into it.
I have it on a picture that my daughter drew that day. I wrote it on there.
And Ken, having done this with you a couple of times before, I just think you invite people to bring out their very best self and to share their most vulnerable self, which is their very best self. So I'm super honored to be here, and I love Blue Cross Shoulder Mask. I wanted to be introduced as a Blue Cross Shoulder Mask team member, but since I'm not, I wasn't allowed to be, because I have a big love in my heart for all y'all. All right, I am going to share my screen so that I can run through some data with you guys, and we can bask in all of this together. So Desiree, just confirm for me that you can see that, yeah? Okay. So the easiest way to describe what Archangels is doing is sort of this dance and this sway that you just heard. I think, Scott, the way you just started by saying that for you, this is a new topic. I think that's true for so many of us, and that, when we talk about stories, we give each other the opportunity to see ourselves reflected in other people's stories and to realize that we ourselves are in that role as well. So Archangels is a national movement and platform that is reframing how caregivers are seen, honored, and supported using a combination of data and stories. And there's that swing and dance as you go through that, right? So we're a movement, but we're also a platform. We're using data, but we're also using stories. Data engages the brain, gives yourself permission, but stories really engage the heart. And I'll also add that because there is this extraordinary fluidity of caregivers, so many of us have to leave the workforce, we really focus intensely on not just working within traditional communication infrastructures like through employers like you guys and health plans, thank you so much, also out through communities and grassroots efforts. And we do a lot of work with from the advocacy perspective through things like RAND or United States of Care, or working with the Harvard Division of Sleep Medicine. And over the course of the time that we've been focused exclusively on caregivers, we've got over 1.5 million data points. So we just are incredibly obsessed with validating the reality that each of us feel and see with data that we can actually act on in credible ways. So I want to start by going back to that caregivers are everywhere. So we've done national polling over the last years, but I'll give you the most recent. When you ask somebody, are you worrying about or caring for the health of a family member, neighbor, or friend? A full 66% of folks say yes. And we've been seeing this tick up since COVID started. The May number was 61, and now we're at 66. And the thing that's extraordinary about talking about caregivers is people don't know what that term means. There's so much confusion, or there's stigma, or someone doesn't want to be labeled that way, or they just think that's a doctor or a nurse. 50% of caregivers don't even respond to the term caregiver, right? Because in their mind, they're like, I'm not a caregiver, I'm just a husband, just a sister, a grandson, a friend, I'm a neighbor. And you've been hearing that thread already. And the reality, when most people think of a caregiver, what pops into their head is a 46-year-old woman who's caring for her mom, because that's the average. And yes, that's true, and she is. But so too are these broad other populations. For example, before COVID, 45% of caregivers were seen as men. And now I've seen numbers that go lower, but I've also seen some numbers going higher. 1 in 4 millennials, 20% are Gen Z. So again, we've got to broaden our definition in our own head of who these caregivers are. Clearly, it is evident to everybody that anyone who's a parent or guardian of a child, regardless, is now also in this role. This is Erin and Benjamin and Emmeline. Erin is a coworker, so too now are Benjamin and Emmeline. So I want to, my heart goes out to each of you who are waiting for the door to crash open and a kid to come running in, or whatever different reality you have. And also to all those essential workers who haven't had the luxury of being able to work from home in COVID, which is for me, I feel lucky in some ways as well. And so if you think about that 66% number for a second and you're listening, I want to ask you guys, please, please, please listen first for yourself, because chances are you are an unpaid caregiver. Also, from everything I understand about who's on this webinar with us today, many of you are also caring for your populations. You're caring for your employees. You're responsible for their health. We call that a double duty caregiver. There was a study that we were part of publishing in collaboration with the Blue Cross Blue Shield Association, their Health of America report. This was extraordinary. And the data was from before COVID, but what you can see is striking. Before COVID, caregivers already had 26% poorer health. And that included more ER visits and more hospitalizations. So the inefficient kind of care that we know is not most valuable for individuals. We were twice as likely to develop chronic illness, and we had twice the rate of depression. So just let those numbers like sink in on you for a second. And how does that manifest? Well, 60% of caregivers reported needing to cut back at work, and any of us caregivers have experienced that. Caregivers are costing employers about $3,200 more. Again, that was before COVID. And replacing a caregiver's salary costs 1.5 times more. So as of COVID, we were really, really lucky at ARCHANGELS to be part of something called the COPE initiative. And we pulled together a bunch of data. Our role in this study that was published by the CDC was to include the role of the caregiver using the Caregiver Intensity Index. And what we found when we did that was, if you look at the impact of COVID on the levels of anxiety and depression, clinically significant anxiety and depression of unpaid caregivers, it is now at 56%. So 56% of us who are in the unpaid caregiver role are experiencing anxiety or depression as of COVID. That's 2.5 times someone who's not a caregiver. The work that we've been doing, Chuck Sizer, the lead author is Mark Sizer. Chuck Sizer was another one of the authors. He runs for Harvard Medical School, the Division of Sleep Medicine. He's a wonderful guy. When we first got started, he sort of fought us. Like, I don't know why we would talk about the caregiver. I don't understand. Why does that matter? This was his quotes. We were not prepared to have this be the issue that really was one of the strongest predictors of an adverse mental health consequence. And that study that I just showed you has had unbelievable, you can read that quote, but I'll tell you it's in the top 1% of publications in the CDC's journal, top 1%. and the top 10 of CDC COVID articles in 2020. So it's got an incredible uptick. Why? It was mentioned in the presidential order. Why has it gotten such uptick? Because it's striking a chord, because people are feeling this reality and this is giving them a way to put real validated data behind it. Shout out to you, Ken, because you were quoted in one of these CNN articles that got a lot of attention as well, by saying you can conclusively say the adults are not all right in America. And when we say all right, what do we mean by saying not all right? We mean really not all right. So I'll build on that 56% and say, okay, that's anxiety or depression. But what is the next step of anxiety or depression? We actually can say that a full close to 1 in 3 unpaid caregivers, again, listen for yourself first, listen for your loved ones, and listen for the ones that you're responsible for, are experiencing suicidal ideation. That's 10 times more the rest of the population, when 1 times is not enough. It is not okay, really not okay. So what do you do when we're really stressed out? We self-medicate, right? I absolutely would be the first to raise my hand and say that on the nights that I'm really, really stressed out, I definitely have a glass or 2 or so of wine or whatever it is, because I need to de-stress, I need to calm down. 33% of us unpaid caregivers are increasing our use of substances to cope, and that's 5 times the rest of the population. And then this is funny in a way, because we started by saying that the Blue Cross Blue Shield Association report, the Health of America report, showed that individuals were overutilizing the ER and the urgent care, and we were anxious about that, right? We call them high flyers, like how do we help them to get better access to care? Now we're like, oh my God, I yearn for the days of folks overutilizing any kind of caregivers, because now caregivers are delaying or avoiding medical care at 5 times the rate for urgent or emergency use of the rest of the population. So the way that this all manifests for us is this caregiver intensity index, which is very straightforward, 2.5 minutes to take, puts you in the green, yellow, or red, and then it crosswalks you over based on your responses to resources to exist to help. And it looks first at what are the 2 places that you have that you really could use the most support that's driving your intensity, but what are the 2 places that you're actually doing well already. And that's a really important thing for us to remember when we think about this balance. And Desiree, your story is so gorgeous. Caregivers go through these moments where there's stuff that's really hard, but there's also things that are achingly beautiful about these roles we're honored enough to play. So when you look at the distribution of green, yellow, or red across the population before COVID, 28% of us in the green, 8% in the red. Obviously the goal, as many people in the green as possible. As of COVID, we're seeing this increase. So what we really want to go through quickly with this data is how levels of intensity are impacted because of different factors in our life. So COVID has driven down those of us in the green and a marked increase of those of us that were in the red. What does it mean to be in the red? Well, let's just look at productivity, for example. If you are in the red, there's a 49% negative impact on your productivity. And if we knew this, and we knew when we created a culture that people could talk openly about being a caregiver, about being an archangel with each other, we could do stuff about it. Now, let's say you're caring for someone with dementia. So you're a caregiver for somebody who's in that state. You're 27% of you are very likely to be having family financial disagreements. That makes sense, right? Of course. Well, what if you're in the red? If you're in the red, it's 63% of you are very likely to be having family financial disagreements. Let's stay on the topic of the money. And let's talk about things that you might not have expected, like 1 in 4 millennials, 1 in 5 Gen Z. Well, there's a myth that money fixes everything. But that is not true if you are a caregiver. Specifically, we see high intensity caregivers at all income levels. And you might see a little bit of a dip, but there's nothing lower than about 12% of high intensity caregivers at every single one of these income levels, which is, these are the components that we're thinking about as intensity increases, these things increase. How do we then think about what do we do, right? How does research drive action, drive impact? Well, here's a wonderful one for you to know. The best buffers, these are the things that increase resiliency, can actually be free. So caregivers is what we can all do, right? As employers who feel strongly supported, even by just one person, 40% lower depression risk than those who don't, 30% lower risk of clinically significant anxiety. And if you know that there's trusted respite services available, even if you don't use them, 70% reduction in stress. So that's huge. And I'll tell you, we've seen this over and over again, that if we don't even crosswalk someone over any of these resources that exist that most people don't know about, don't utilize because they don't think of themselves as a caregiver, if all we do is say you're not alone, back to Ken's point, thank you, May Mental Health Awareness Month, we see a reduction in caregiver intensity. So feast your eyes on the slide for a second. I just want you to know this is unbelievable the way this data, when you pull it together and look at all these other angles as it relates to caregiver intensity, what that slide says is, and this is going to be a surprise for most of us. It was a surprise for me until I thought about my own experience as an employed caregiver. Employed caregivers with medium or high intensity have less depression, anxiety, or stress than non-employed caregivers. Employed caregivers with medium or high intensity, less depression, anxiety, or stress than non-employed caregivers. Now, anyone who's lived it knows it. I run to work some days. Why? Because work can be respite. So again, our goal, and I'll close out with this last point, how do we get as many caregivers as we can to be seen, to be in the green, to be supported, to be crosswalked to these resources that exist? And it is such a joy that yesterday, there was actually a Senate hearing in Massachusetts. We were lucky enough to get to present at it. And there was a quote by Senator Spilka. She described it as a moonshot, a long-term effort to reimagine care systems in the state to better support the people, particularly women, caring for loved ones of all ages and help them stay in the workforce. So a big old heart for that. And I'll stop sharing and turn it back to you, Desiree. But it's unbelievable when you see this level of attention and momentum, all the data, but also all those stories that are amounting to a full-fledged effort to support this gorgeous, gorgeous population.
Thank you. That was a lot of information and, great points to be making. We did have one question that I actually want you to address right now because it's relevant to one of the slides you just showed. So when we're looking at caregiver intensity, we had some acronyms in there, CII or 11. Can you explain what that is again?
Yeah, the Caregiver Intensity Index.
There we go.
Your level of intensity drives your score between 0 and 100, and you're green, yellow, or red.
Excellent. Thank you. And there's a lot to unpack and talk about with how that relates to mental health, how that relates to all of us as caregivers. I can tell you before I was asked to be part of this, I didn't know I was a caregiver. I looked at the description and said, oh, that's me. That's great. This is fun to dive into and know more about. And then one thing that folks on the call might be thinking about as well, as you're listening to this, you might be thinking about the Massachusetts Paid Family and Medical Leave Program. As a caregiver, as an employer, you might think, well, what benefits do I have access to? So starting on July 1st, individuals may be eligible for leave to care for a family member with a serious health condition. And this may be causing some anxiety. You might be thinking, if the caregiver definition is so broad, are employees suddenly going to request leave? Are we going to have gaps to fill when we're already struggling during the pandemic? And just as Alex said, from what we know, the key, very important thing to support caregivers is before they get to that point where they're at a breaking point and need to step away from work. Most caregivers, I can tell you myself, don't want to take time off from work. That's why I brought the laptop with me to the physical therapy appointment. But they need the ability to do so, just knowing that is in your back pocket to manage that level of stress. It's not necessarily something I have to do. I didn't have to bring my laptop, something I chose to do. But I would know that if I had to take a day away or take a step back and de-stress, that was there for me, that I could do it. Okay. So back to you, Ken. What do you think about these caregivers who are struggling to cope, and what comes in mind to support them?
Well, I think the first of all is to acknowledge that if you're battling with some measure of anxiety, depression, or even thoughts about your own safety, you're clearly not alone. And the stresses of this pandemic, plus the role of caregiving, have been a real tax on people. There are support groups. There are places to go to find people. So let's just take the National Alliance on Mental Illness. There's millions of Americans that are caring for adult children who live with serious mental health concerns. And there's a fantastic set of psychoeducation and family support groups. And that can all be found at NAMI.org. There's 650 chapters across America. So wherever you are, there's a group if you want to connect. And again, of course, you may not feel that you have the time to do it, which I fully appreciate, the intensity of time. But when the time is right, you should know people generate a lot of giving to each other and getting a lot from each other. I do want to mention that at Blue Cross, and I know this isn't available everywhere, but this is something to think about. Our leadership changed our sick days to wellness days, which gave people more permission to take care of themselves. I fully appreciate that isn't happening everywhere, but it's a progressive statement of what's happening to people now. And I was very proud of the leadership of the organization to do that. And I think it's aspirational for a lot of companies, but it's also something to think about. Some of the people on this conversation are going to be leaders, are going to be making choices, and it's just something to consider. LinkedIn, an acknowledgement of what everybody's going through, gave their entire staff a week off of paid vacation. Again, these are different approaches to what people are up against.
Actually, there's a great question that I'll punt it over to you again, Ken. So when you're thinking about wellness days and taking a day off, the way we have things structured here at Blue Cross, there's a question that says, you mentioned taking time off to de-stress. So does this mean when I need to take a day off to de-stress, I can, versus taking time off to take a person to an appointment, meaning my time off is mine, my time versus giving care?
Right. Well, I think this is so individual, and I fully recognize that time is the currency. And
Yeah.
I'm not saying that it's necessarily a day of self-care and leisure. I think it's just an organizational acknowledgement of less work pressure, and that you can take off the plate. That doesn't mean the other things aren't still there, but the working assumption with that is that you don't have to say that you're sick. You're allowed to say, I need a day to attend to myself and my life. And your life is going to be a lot about caregiving. So that's just my perspective, but I fully appreciate it does not create more time.
And there are other companies that deal with that with paid time off as one big bucket, not necessarily delineating between a vacation day and a sick day, that sort of thing. I'm not saying that one is better than the other, but there are different ways that you can support family and caregivers in that space. And at Blue Cross, we recognize that supporting caregivers is critical. We want to support both our members who are caregivers and caregivers of our members. So we would like you to check out our new website about caregiver support, which will be in the chat in just a minute. And I'm very excited to announce that Blue Cross will be the lead sponsor for ARCHANGELS Any Care Counts campaign as an experiment to engage and support caregivers. So Alex, can you tell us more about the campaign and how we can support the caregivers around us?
Yeah. Yes. Yay. So I'll just say quickly, the notion of language, wellness days, right? So important, not a sickness day, it's a wellness day. Why do we say archangel, not caregiver? Because the notion of archangel is aspirational. Like caregivers are gorgeous. They're these warrior angels, right? Spreading their wings over these people that they love, supporting them. So Any Care Counts campaign is launching this fall, and it is all about recognizing all the key points we've just been talking about, that there are caregivers everywhere, and that truly any care counts. And you both gave a bunch of different examples of what constitutes care. So we're going to get that message out there any way possible. I think the reality of how many folks don't see themselves in that role, Desiree, the number of times someone we're working with says, I realized over the course of our conversation, Alex, that I'm actually a caregiver. Absolutely, 66% of us are in that role. So that's what we're all about, is how do we feel good? If we don't see ourselves in that role, we can't feel good about what we're doing. And we can't get linked over to the resources that exist, right? Ken just rolled out one. Desiree, you know others. I know a ton. There are a bunch that are available free across the state, not to mention with your employers. So this is all about helping caregivers of all kinds be seen for all the different ways they care and get them honored and supported in that role. So are you mowing the lawn of an elder neighbor? That's care. Are you paying the bills for a loved one? That's care. Are you calling an isolated, lonely family member every single night? That's care. And any care counts. So we'll be rolling this out through all the traditional channels that you would expect, right? Through employers like you guys, but also through community-based grassroots efforts like faith-based organizations and barbershops and hair salons and fairs and organizations like Community Servings. And the effort's truly going to be omni-channel. So we'll be running the gamut from social to in-person. It would be amazing if there were a billboard or two. Any care counts, and our goal is to get that out there in any way possible so that caregivers can feel less alone, can feel seen and honored and supported in that role.
Wonderful. And I think we have in the chat a link to the ARCHANGELS web page as well. I think we're going to be adding that as well. Great. So this was a wonderful presentation, so much information from Ken and Alex. And now we're going to move on to the Q&A portion right on time. And before we get started, as you're thinking of your questions that you want to ask Ken or Alex or myself, we're going to launch a poll. So look out for the poll. It's going to be coming up in a minute. And as it's coming up, there we go. Great. So please feel free to answer these questions, and we'll collect the answers. And as we're doing that, I'll start off with a question to you, Alex. Now, it's easy to say, and people have said this to me all the time. If you need anything, just let me know. I'm here for you. It's just this general bucket statement of, I got your back. But, do you got my back at 2 a.m. when when I need something? What does that mean? Can you give some advice on, if you want to support someone who is a caregiver, how can you be more specific and tangible so that they feel like they actually can rely on someone who says they want to help?
Yeah. The first thing I would say, we say this all the time at Archangels. First of all, don't ask, just help. Because caregivers are so overwhelmed, they're not going to be able to figure out. So if you're caring for someone, let's say you're the archangel of someone who's an archangel for someone else, which we see is the strongest way to be supporting them. What you need to do is observe what they need. So if I'm your friend, Desiree, which I really hope to be, then I'm going to pay attention to the things that you're needing, right? You might need someone to watch out for your 2 other children while you're taking your child to the doctor's appointment. I'm going to pay attention to that. I'm going to fill your fridge without you asking. I'm going to mow your lawn without you asking. I'm going to show up on the days that I know you might need support without you asking. And these ways that people can be supported, sometimes it's as straightforward as just saying to someone, I can be your red phone. If you need 1 minute to just say every single swear because you're having one of those moments, call me and I'm just going to listen, right? I can be that red phone for you when you're going through one of those moments of high anxiety or stress.
Well, that's
And
a great
I want to
answer.
make one other point, which I didn't say strongly enough before, because I'm so excited about this, which is I really do hope you check out that link, because we really would love to be working with folks on this Any Care Counts campaign, because what it'll do is increase awareness so that more of us, it's not for caregivers to self-identify, it's for us to create these communities that are so fertile and lush with support and recognition of caregivers that I don't have to raise my hand. Someone else is going to see me in that role and they're going to love on me in it and they're going to crosswalk me to the support that exists.
Alex, have you ever complained about somebody who's delivered good food?
Never.
Yeah, this is what I'm thinking here, because that's a love act, right? Food is love.
Food is love.
The things, but it's also love. And this is one of the things we see in the mental health space. And I know I'm the psychiatrist here, but when people come out of psychiatric hospitals, they don't get casseroles yet. Like, we're still not there as a society, and people don't feel comfortable or open enough. And I think that's true of a lot of caregiving. We don't want to upset somebody who we know is already up against it, right? Wouldn't you say that's your experience?
Oh, 100%. In fact, I'll tell you, it's a funny story. We just lost my mom-in-law and we were very lucky. She died here with us in our home. We know how blessed we were to have that. After she died, my honey said to me, why aren't people showing up with food? And I was like, oh, well, people have been asking, but I thought since you love to cook, you wouldn't want that. I literally had been shutting down people's efforts to love on us with food. And he's like, what are you talking about? I have no energy to cook. I'm so exhausted. And I was like,
So drained. Yeah.
I'm the worst. I know. But that's my point. Like, I didn't know that was a way to love on people was with food, because in my family, that's not what we did. We didn't show up with food. Oh boy, do I know now from my friends who are unpaid caregivers, you know what I'm doing? I'm showing up with food, period. I don't ask. I go to the door and I leave the food there.
It's a universal expression of I see you and I'm doing a little something for you.
Absolutely. Before we move on to our next question, though, we do have the poll results. And yep, there we go. Okay, so before today, did you consider yourself a caregiver? 66% said yes, so a good portion of you realized that you're in that role. 31% said no, and 3% wasn't sure. And then based on today's discussion, we jumped all the way up to 91% of folks feel like they are a caregiver. 7% said no, and 2% still aren't sure. So I think this has been widely educational and eye-opening for at least some of the folks on the call today. Back on that food topic, I just say, my dad drops off mangoes and he doesn't even ring the doorbell or say hi or anything. Sometimes he's just kind of driving by my house and all of a sudden I'll find mangoes in my front step. And that's just, again, that little, here you go, thinking about you. I don't know how helpful this is, but I know the kids love mangoes and they'll get you a snack at least for the day. Okay, so let's look to the questions that we're getting now. So some of the questions we're getting kind of specific to work environment. So I do want to keep things high level and make sure that people understand, if you have something specific for where you're working and what you're doing, the best thing you can do is have a conversation with your HR department, your boss, the supports that you have at your company to understand what services you might be able to access. So what we're talking about here is a high level, what individuals can do and companies can do to support caregivers, but we might not be able to address specific work environments. But in general, let's go to Alex and then Ken. If you are working in a place where you physically need to be there and you don't have the luxury like I do of bringing a laptop to an appointment, how do you manage that job that you have to be physically present for and the caregiving that you might be doing?
Yeah. What I would say is almost every organization has thought about this extensively. These resources exist. They might not be titled, "Hey, caregiver, we can help you," right? It might be, if you need, it's under the Employee Assistance Program or as part of the ERG, we can help with legal advice. We can help with financial advice. We can help with behavioral health support. We can help with finding daycare coverage for you. So I think one of the most important things that we need to be doing is, one, as employers, be using different language and all sorts of approaches to get folks to recognize that we see them in this role and that we do have resources available, and consider unbundling where those resources are right now if they're not getting utilized, because again, the utilization of these supportive resources is often so low. And that's what's so sad, is, it's there and it's not being used because caregivers don't see themselves in this role.
That's great.
Interesting silver lining of the pandemic, Desiree and Alex, is that I'm now being asked to give dozens of talks to HR organizations. Workplaces have begun to really take this on. Not necessarily caregiving alone, but the mental health aspects of their employees and how to communicate to their employees that there's a culture of acceptance. Organizations are in variable stages of change on that. And then how do they structure their benefits? Do they have liberal benefits, liberal copays? Do they make it easy for you to get help? And at Blue Cross, we have an insourced mental health team. Somebody will worry with you while you try to find a therapist in the most fragmented and chaotic of systems, which is the so-called mental health system, where 15,000 individual practitioners take good care of you, but they're not thinking about access. They're thinking about the people they care for. And this leads you to a feeling of you've called 10 people and you can't find a mental health clinician. And so if you call the number on the back of your card, we'll worry with you and try to problem solve that. But how you structure your benefits, if you're an HR leader on this, how you set a work culture, and what tools you give people that they don't have to take time. There are online cognitive behavioral coaching strategies that you can do when you're up. When you're up and awake and have free time might be different than someone else, and it might be different than a social worker's time frame. And these have shown to be pretty effective, and more people use them than I thought.
Yeah.
The idea is they're self-winding. There's a dozen companies like this. I don't think anyone has a magic tool, but it's a coaching construct.
Well, and the other thing I'll say on that one is, again, like caregivers, when time, you said this so beautifully, Ken, is like the most valuable asset we have, and caregivers often don't have a lot about it. What can we be doing as HR leaders, as leaders in whatever the definition of a leader is in your organization? Tell your story. Because when you tell your story, by definition, you are normalizing, destigmatizing, celebrating this role. So individuals, caregivers, can see themselves reflected in it. And just knowing you're not alone, going back to the first thing we said, just knowing you're not alone is care. That's treatment. That's reducing stress, reducing anxiety. So start there. And then if somebody is in a stage where they're ready to take that next step, awesome. Make sure they know what those resources are. But if all you do is normalize across your organization, hey, caregivers, you rock, we see you, we love you, we've got stuff to support you when you're ready, you'll be taking enormous steps forward in the mental health of your, and physical health and productivity health of your population.
Great. And our next question, I'm going to punt over to you, Ken, and it's a question about guilt. When you're caring for other people and you want to take time for yourself, that can make you feel very guilty and selfish. What do you think we should do? How would you advise folks on that feeling of guilt?
Well, I see you've entrusted me with the easy questions. So I lost my brother 2 years ago. He was my best friend. And I moved to Philadelphia for 4 months to look after him. And I was overwhelmed with the experience. Everybody was great at work, actually. And I just want to acknowledge that. Blue Cross was nice to me about it. And they understood. And I'm not as good as Desiree. I did a few things. I didn't do nearly as many things. And my situation was slightly more acute. He was on a ventilator for 80 days. And then he passed in my arms. And I had 3 vacations, little 3-day trips planned. And I was racked with guilt. I skipped 2 of them and I took 1 of them. And I didn't enjoy the one I took. I didn't enjoy it because I was so guilt-ridden. So I don't have an answer for this as a person other than to be gentle with yourself. I was there for him. He had lost his wife 6 months before, and I was his best friend. And I did everything I could. I delivered him the Philadelphia Inquirer. I brought him running stupid jokes. I listened to the Philadelphia Phillies. I don't like the Philadelphia Phillies. I'm a Red Sox fan. I listened to Philadelphia Phillies on the radio every single night, and I actually got kind of into it with him. And it was a beautiful moment. But the truth is, I was trying to run a sprint in a marathon. And you can't run a sprinter's pace in a marathon. And I had to take breaks because I was beginning to get, I wouldn't say irritable. I was becoming less generous in my heart inside. I think I was editing it out, maybe. He was picking up on stuff. And so I did take the 4-day vacation. It was a crummy vacation, but I did go somewhere else and do something else. And I held my fingers that he wouldn't pass while I was gone. And the doctors thought he might stick around. So my story is ordinary. I don't say this story because it's extraordinary. Everybody goes through some variation on this. But I did feel guilty. But in the main, I was so fortunate that my employer allowed me to keep my job and love somebody. And so I used up every sick day imaginable, right? Because caring for a sick person is sick day time, which I didn't know until I got into it. And I think that being gentle with yourself, you're doing the best you can, right? I think it's really hard. The person who was stationed in Kuwait, who wasn't able to care for him at all, was racked with guilt for these last several years. And it's another family member, and that person has really had a much harder experience. They weren't able to be a caregiver. Weren't able to just say, I'll hop the next plane out of Kuwait. He's in the service. And so I guess be grateful for the opportunity to give and be gentle with yourself. And remember, it's a marathon, not a sprint, right? If I had run it at a sprinter's pace, I undoubtedly would have become an unhelpful caregiver for my run of time.
Yeah.
So Desiree, I think about this one all the time. Ken, sending you such a smooch about that story, by the way. So I want to use an example of dementia, which I know many of us are caring for somebody who's in an altered cognitive state. And I will find myself in my personal caregiver situation sometimes feeling so frustrated with this person because they're saying the same thing over and over again, that I actually dig my fingernails into my thighs because I want to keep a smile on my face. And then I lie awake in the middle of the night and I feel so guilty, like you're such a jerk that you would ever be cranky with this person who you love so much. Like, what is wrong with you? And I can't sleep and I'm so angry at myself. And I call that double jeopardy now. Like, you have the guilt and the frustration, and then you feel guilty about the guilt and your response. Like, we have to stop that. So most importantly, forgive yourself. Tell your story to a friend, hear their story, they're going to have the same one. And this is my secret of how I now fall back to sleep, which I offer to each of you. I stop thinking about all the things I suck at. It's a never-ending list. I'll never go back to sleep. Instead, what I focus on is what are 3 things I know I can do tomorrow for somebody else? Because there's a thing called a helper's high. And when we support somebody else, it actually helps us feel better. And so I'll be like, okay, I know that so-and-so is going through this. I can do this one thing. So-and-so has this. I can do this one thing. I can give my all to that. Those are 3 things. Bam, I go back to sleep. So forgive yourself and think about what you can do for someone else. It sounds dorky, but it actually helps.
And I'll give my 2 cents on this topic as well, and then we'll start to close things out for the day. So what I do when I'm feeling guilty, so there's all kinds of guilt, right? There's mom guilt, there's working parent guilt, there's non-working parent guilt, there's caregiver guilt. It's endless amount of guilt. I think about my daughter, and if she were in my shoes, how would I want her life to look? Would I want her to dedicate every minute she has to her child and not take care of herself at all? So I'm kind of thinking, all this work I'm putting into her, I want her to love herself, to care for herself, and to have that when she's my age. So I have to model for her self-care so that she knows how to care for herself and have that foundation when she's older as well. So I'll tell her, I can't do blah, 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 because I'm going to go get my brows waxed, or, I'm going to go do something that's taking care of myself, even just a little way. No, can't help you right now because I'm sitting here and drinking my tea and taking a minute for myself. And I think hopefully she'll see that, hopefully I'm doing it in a balanced way, and that she'll be able to emulate that when she is a grown-up as well.
Desiree, I interview people with their mental health concerns, and a man just told me that one of the things that helped him on his journey to accepting his schizoaffective disorder, homelessness, and all the problems it had is that the family was no longer on him. The family said, we love you and we're here for you, but we're actually not going to chase you. And he kind of thought, he was in his 20s, so a different situation, but a variation on this theme. If they're not all on me, maybe they think I can do it. Again, and that's not true for everyone. It's not true in every situation, but it was just told to me yesterday as I'm trying to collect stories for people with mental health journeys for a little project I'm working on. And I was so taken with that perspective. This idea that the family's relaxation, the family's self-care was a piece of his healing.
Yeah.
Was novel to me. Like, I didn't think that was really a thing. And it turns out that the way you're thinking is very, very helpful to the person who's being cared for, because their experience has to also be, my mom's a great mom and she gets to have a life. And, it's not only about me, right?
Right. And I think probably your brother would think that same thing for you too, right? Caring for
It's a
yourself.
different story.
We're all gonna cry. No, we can't end like this. Okay, so wrapping it up. This was a great conversation. Thank you both very much. We've all kind of poured our hearts out here a little bit. No saying you cry, saying me cry again. Can't do that. And Blue Cross is very, very excited to be the sponsor for Any Care Counts campaign, partnering with Alex and ARCHANGELS as an experiment, again, to engage with caregivers and support them in this way. If you want to learn more about the campaign, we have the link in the chat. One more time, Stephanie. And thank you both. Thank you both so much for coming, for sharing, for having this wonderful conversation. We could tell that it really impacted people in the chat. Other people feel more confident in sharing their vulnerabilities as well. So at the end of this, some just wrap up stuff. We're going to be sending out a recording via email by the end of the week. So keep your eyes open for that. We'll also be sending a survey to you. Please keep your eyes open for that survey. We want to hear what you thought about this conversation. Actually, sorry, it'll pop up immediately after this webinar ends. So keep your eyes open for that at the end of this. And for those caregivers, so 91% of you who are listening to this, and hopefully some of it resonated with you, take a moment today, go take a walk. Maybe you might be feeling emotional. I know we're feeling emotional right now after this conversation. Take that minute for yourself and have a great rest of your day. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, guys. Thank you so much.
Are we all crying? Yes.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't plan on telling